The growl of diesel engines rumbling down my street at 7 o'clock a.m. wasn't anything unusual for our coastal neighborhood. What was unusual, though, was seeing two enormous tow trucks crawling straight into my driveway, their operators already unloading chains, hooks, and wheel lifts like they were preparing for a battlefield extraction. I set my coffee down on the porch rail, adjusted the sweatshirt that read Coast Guard Veteran, and walked outside to find three men circling my covered patrol vessel like scavengers eyeing a fresh carcass. "Morning, gentlemen," I said, keeping my tone steady even though irritation was already tightening in my chest. "Mind telling me why you're on my property?" The lead driver, a burly guy whose coveralls looked permanently dyed with engine grease, didn't even bother granting me a full glance. "Got orders from the HOA to remove this abandoned boat," he said flatly. "Paperwork says it's been sitting here more than 30 days without movement." I almost laughed out loud. Abandoned? The vessel sitting beneath that custom marine cover was a 28-foot Coast Guard response boat assigned to me for routine maintenance and inspection. It had been in my driveway for exactly 12 days, and every inch of it was federally owned equipment. "I'd suggest you stop what you're doing and leave immediately," I told them, pulling out my phone. "That boat belongs to the United States Coast Guard, and I've got the documentation to prove it." The driver shrugged like this was just another Tuesday. "Not my problem. HOA President says it goes. It goes. You want to argue? Take it up with her." That was the moment I hit record and dialed a number I hoped I'd never have to use in this neighborhood. Within minutes, three black SUVs with government plates came tearing around the corner like a storm front. Suddenly, those tow truck drivers didn't look nearly as confident. "My name is Jake Sullivan, and I've served in the Coast Guard for 15 years. 6 months ago, I moved into this quiet community in Pelican Bay, drawn by the water access and the promise of a peaceful residential area. What I hadn't realized was that 3 months before I arrived, the neighborhood had elected a new HOA president named Karen Bellwether, a woman who apparently believed her position was a divine mandate to micromanage every driveway, lawn, and mailbox within a 5-block radius. The trouble started the moment I brought the patrol boat home. As part of my duties overseeing fleet maintenance for the district, I occasionally needed to store vessels at authorized locations for inspections or minor repairs. My property had been vetted and approved by the Coast Guard, complete with security standards and federal permission. I even went the extra mile introducing myself to the neighbors, explaining why the vessel would be there, and assuring everyone it was temporary. Most people were fascinated. The Johnsons next door brought their grandkids over to admire it. Old Mr. Peterson, a Navy vet himself, saluted it on his morning walk. But Karen saw it as an affront to her perfectly curated suburban kingdom, an eyesore, a violation, and worst of all, something she didn't personally approve. The first notice appeared on my door 3 days after the boat arrived. Written in Comic Sans, laminated for reasons still unknown to mankind. It claimed my vessel violated HOA bylaws on recreational vehicles, watercraft, and commercial equipment. I responded politely, sending her copies of my federal authorization and explaining that the vessel was government property, not a recreational boat, and that federal law superseded HOA regulations. Her reply came the next day via certified mail. She dismissed my so-called federal papers, insisting HOA rules were supreme inside the community. It was painfully obvious. She'd never heard of the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution, but I tried to be diplomatic. I invited her to inspect the vessel in person, see the Coast Guard markings, and review the documentation. She showed up that evening with 2 board members, a clipboard, and the smuggest look I have ever seen on a human being. She was exactly as you'd imagine middle-aged, sporting an asymmetrical haircut that probably cost more than my monthly marine maintenance budget, and wearing an outfit that screamed, "I demand to speak to your manager," from across the neighborhood. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, pronouncing my name like it physically hurt. "I don't care if this boat belongs to the Queen of England. It's an eyesore. It's lowering property values. It needs to go." I walked her around the vessel, pointing out the Coast Guard insignia, federal property placards, and registration numbers. I showed her the maintenance log, the security requirements, and even a letter from my commanding officer approving temporary storage. She took photos of everything but not to understand any of it. No, she was building what she probably thought was an ironclad case. "This is clearly a commercial vehicle," she announced, ignoring the massive US Coast Guard lettering on the hull. "And that tarp, not an HOA approved color. It needs to be navy blue or forest green, not gray. It's a military-grade weather cover," I replied calmly. "It protects sensitive equipment. Then it should be stored on a military base, not in our peaceful neighborhood," she snapped. "You have 7 days to remove it, or you'll be fined $50 a day, ma'am." "With all due respect," I said, "you can't fine me for storing federally owned equipment I'm legally authorized to maintain. This isn't my boat. It's your country's boat, the same Coast Guard vessel that protects these waters and responds to emergencies." She actually snorted. "The HOA protects this neighborhood, Mr. Sullivan, not your little boat club." 7 days after she left, I immediately contacted our legal affairs office. They confirmed I was fully within my rights and even offered to send an official letter explaining the situation. I thought that would end it. But I vastly underestimated Karen Bellwether's mix of stubbornness and ignorance. The fines began exactly 7 days later, 50 a day, right on schedule. Then she got creative. I suddenly violated noise ordinances, despite the boat not having made a single sound. My driveway supposedly exceeded the maximum coverage allowed for recreational vehicles, never mind that this wasn't one. She even claimed the height of the boat's cover violated airspace restrictions, which I'm fairly certain she invented that same morning. By the end of week 2, she claimed I owed over $2,000 in HOA fines. She mailed copies to every resident, trying to stir the neighborhood against me. She posted pictures on the community Facebook page with captions like, "Is this the neighborhood we want?" and "Commercial vehicles destroy property values." Most neighbors weren't buying it. Several neighbors even volunteered to speak on my behalf at the next HOA meeting. But Karen had already stacked the board with loyalists, and she ran every agenda like a dictator at a microphone. She scheduled a special session solely to address the boat problem, as she dramatically labeled it. I showed up that night with a folder full of documentation and a Coast Guard legal representative who'd driven down specifically to deal with this escalating circus. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Wells was a no-nonsense officer who had handled civilian interference cases before. During the public comment period, she stood, straightened her uniform, and delivered the facts with the kind of authority that could stop a moving freight train. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the weight of federal law. "Petty Officer Sullivan is conducting authorized maintenance on a Coast Guard vessel. This is not an HOA preference issue. Interfering with him or the vessel may constitute a federal offense. I strongly advise you to rescind all fines and cease further harassment immediately." Karen's face darkened into a shade of purple didn't know humans could achieve. "This is a closed community matter," she sputtered. "You have no authority here, ma'am," Wells replied coolly. "I have the full authority of the United States government. Your HOA rules do not and cannot supersede federal law. If you continue on this path, you'll learn exactly how far that authority reaches." Chaos erupted. Karen's supporters yelled about community standards. A few brave residents tried to point out the obvious legal danger, but Karen shut them down with procedural nonsense and threats of fines for disruptive behavior. In the end, she rammed through a resolution declaring the boat a nuisance and authorizing its removal by any means necessary. When I objected, she actually smiled. "HOA rules override everything, Mr. Sullivan. You'll learn that soon enough." That was Thursday night. The following Tuesday, I returned from morning inspections at the base to find my driveway empty. The boat cover and all was gone. Only the wheel chocks remained, tossed carelessly onto my lawn. My security cameras had been spray painted over, but my neighbor's camera had a perfect angle. His footage showed Karen herself directing the tow trucks at 6 o'clock a.m., clipboard in hand, proudly watching as they hauled away federal property. She even took selfies with the boat being removed, likely intended for her next Facebook victory post. What she didn't comprehend was that she had just committed multiple federal crimes. I immediately reported it not to local police, but to the Coast Guard Investigative Service. When I explained that a civilian had stolen a government vessel containing classified navigation and emergency response equipment, things escalated fast. Within an hour, the base commander was involved. Within 2 hours, federal agents were mobilizing. The vessel was located at a commercial tow yard 15 miles away, dumped in a back lot with a note to bill the HOA for storage. The yard owner, realizing something was seriously wrong when federal agents arrived, cooperated instantly. He handed over all paperwork, including the work order signed by Karen Bellwether and paid for with an HOA credit card, while agents secured the vessel and inspected it for damage. Another team headed straight to the HOA office. They found Karen sitting at her desk, surrounded by what she must have believed were triumphant photos of the boat's removal. Her expression evaporated when agents in tactical vests entered with federal warrants. "Karen Bellwether?" the lead agent asked. She nodded, suddenly mute. "You are under investigation for theft of government property, interference with federal operations, and misuse of HOA funds. You have the right to remain silent." To her credit, she tried to bluster. "This is ridiculous. I was enforcing community standards. That boat was abandoned." "Ma'am," the agent said, pulling out the very documentation I had provided weeks earlier. "We have copies of your federal notifications, warnings from Coast Guard Legal Affairs, and video evidence of you directing the theft of a vessel containing classified equipment. I strongly advise you to stop talking and call a lawyer." The investigation was fast and brutal. They subpoenaed HOA financial records and discovered Karen had used almost $8,000 of community funds for the illegal removal money earmarked for landscaping services. She'd also issued fines without board approval, pocketed portions of them, and threatened residents who questioned her authority. But the worst was yet to come. When federal tech specialists examined the boat, they discovered that the towing company had damaged several sensitive components in the removal process, including encrypted communication modules and navigation systems. What might have been a simple theft now included destruction of government property and potential breaches of classified equipment security. The base commander was furious, and the U.S. Attorney's Office was eager to prosecute. The HOA board called an emergency meeting that night, this time without Karen, who was busy attempting to post bail. The remaining board members were in full panic mode, scrambling to distance themselves from her. They unanimously voted to revoke all fines against me, issue a formal apology, and cooperate completely with federal authorities. Several members resigned on the spot, wanting no connection to the disaster. Others admitted Karen had bullied them into supporting her vendetta, but had been too afraid to speak out earlier. The community Facebook page exploded with residents sharing their own stories of Karen's intimidation and abuse of power. Meanwhile, I assisted federal agents in cataloging the vessel's damage. Every scratch, every compromised seal, every loosened bolt had to be documented. Repairs alone totaled more than $40,000, not including the replacement of classified equipment that had to be treated as compromised. Karen's arraignment was a spectacle. She marched into the court, still insisting the HOA had the authority to remove anything she deemed a nuisance. The federal magistrate judge, a former Navy officer, stared her down with zero patience. She was charged with theft of government property, destruction of federal assets, interference with military operations, misuse of fiduciary funds, and several other counts that made her attorney visibly wince. The Coast Guard issued a public statement thanking me for my service and warning civilians about interfering with military property. Local news ran the story, and Karen quickly became the poster child for out-of-control HOA presidents. Her real estate business, which I hadn't even known she ran, started losing clients by the day. Her trial was scheduled for 6 months later, but the evidence was bulletproof. Her own photos and videos showed her directing the theft. The financial trail was airtight. Numerous witnesses testified to her harassment and threats. Eventually, her lawyer convinced her to accept a plea deal: 18 months in federal prison, $30,000 in restitution, and 5 years of probation, during which she was barred from serving on any HOA board. When the judge read the sentence, Karen actually fainted. Court officers helped her into a chair as she mumbled in disbelief, claiming she was only trying to protect the neighborhood. Insisting HOA rules were supposed to safeguard property values, the judge's final words were perfect. "Ma'am, you have learned the hard way that there is a hierarchy of law in this country, and your HOA is not at the top of it.